Gerai. Labas rytas, kad neatrodytų, kad...
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let us not pretend that we are waiting for Vladimir Putin, which sometimes happens. So we have one keynote speaker and we see other guests coming.
Bet galite, aš sakau, tai viskas yra kažkaip tai pabandysiu dar tą pauzę užpildyti, kad paskui nereiktų atimti laiko ir pasidžiaugti, kad šis lapkritis yra solidarumo su Tibeto mėnuo. Kažkaip tai taip nutiko Lietuvoje, nes šiandien yra diskusija apie Tibetas, tarptautinis konfliktas, kurį būtina išspręsti. O lygiai už 2 savaičių atvažiuoja 3 Tibeto tremtyje parlamento atstovai. Tikimės, čia bus ir susitikimas ir su Seimo užsienio reikalų komitetu, su kažkuo iš vadovybės, gal net ir spaudos konferencija, o paskui 12 valandą numatoma tokia diskusija, pokalbis apie situaciją Tibete, apie tai šiandien mes daugiau diskutuojame iš tokio teisinio kampo, o tada diskutuosime su žmonėmis, kurie atstovauja šiandien Tibetą, kiek tai įmanoma atstovauti okupacijos sąlygomis. Tai tikrai čia yra registracija, kiek man Jovita, mano padėjėja, sakė, paskelbta, tai turėtų išstebėkite arba bus, tai galima registruotis ir dalyvauti čia lygiai už 2 savaičių, lapkričio 21 dieną. Tai va, tai kol ateina svečiai ir sėdasi, aš toliau tada tą įvadą dar pratęsiu. Ir pasakysiu, kad tikrai džiugu, kad šiandien vyksta toks renginys ir tikrai aukštame lygmenyje. Ir dėkoju visiems susirinkusiems, nes žinau, kad čia labai daug visokių renginių. Todėl, kad kiek pamenu praeitoje kadencijoje, kai reikėjo steigti šitą komisiją, šitą parlamentinę solidarumo su Tibeto grupę, buvo labai daug problemų ir buvo net neaiškumų, ar pavyks tokią grupę įsteigti, nes būta daug... Būta daug tokių dalykų, kad tikrai politika Tibeto atžvilgių Europoje ir Kinijos atžvilgių keitėsi, nes jeigu matytume dar prieš kokius 5 metus, paminėjimas, kad galima įpykdyti ko nors Kiniją, susilaukdavo labai daug tokios reakcijos. Atsimenu, kai mums čia su dalyvaujančių vyčių, su namu, teko tada buvusi tuometinį prezidentą, ar kaip ten prezidentas atrodo vadinasi, prezidentas Tibeto surengti čia ir spaudos.
Our establishment of our parliamentary group for relations with Tibet faced many problems. The embassy of China wrote letters to us, thanks to our Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The issue was resolved. Now we are addressing the issue of Taiwan, Hong Kong, Uyghur people. This is top of our agenda. The issue of Tibet, due to the lack of information, is not that widely discussed in a dynamic way. And due to fewer journeys by His Holiness, and I'm glad now that we can discuss this topic today. I would like to inform our guests that November is an important month for us, because in 2 weeks time we will have a discussion with 3 members of Parliament of Tibet in exile, and they will be the follow-up of today's discussion. I'm very glad that we have this discussion today. It is webcast online, and we will also be able to have the recording of this roundtable discussion. This is thanks to Laima Andrikienė that we were able to have this roundtable discussion. And I believe that for Laima Andrikienė, this event is one of the last events for her in the parliament, because she's going on other engagements, and I'm sure that she will be interested in the topic of Tibet. She is a politician that has been consistently following and addressing this issue. Thanks to her, we are having here a guest, an author of a very interesting book. I read this book and I would like this book translated into the Lithuanian language. Professor Praag, and his book Tibet 2020, which clearly states why Tibet is to be considered occupied and should not be considered an internal issue of China. I'm also very glad to see Sonam. He's a wonderful person. It is a pleasure to see him every time. He's also a friend of Lithuania and knows the situation of Lithuania very well. And we also have Dainius Žalimas. More than 20 years ago, we used to hoist the flag of Tibet in Rotušės square with Dainius and several other people in our group. And Dainius Žalimas is a lawyer who will continue fighting for the freedom of Tibet, and he is very well engaged in the topic. He's interested in all the causes for freedom, including Chechnya. So I tried to fill in the pause before our guests arrived. This is a book I would like to give you. It is related to the pilgrimage. And now, thank you very much. I thank the members of the Parliamentary Group for Relations with Tibet. I also thank representatives of NGOs that support the freedom of Tibet. The square of Tibet in Vilnius is becoming a very symbolic place. And now I would like to give the floor to Laima Andrikienė. I'm sorry, Laima would like to give the floor to our guest, Sonam Tsering Frasi. He is the representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama for the Northern Europe, Poland and the Baltic states.
Sorry, I'll repeat this. It is a great pleasure, honor, and indeed a pleasure to be in Lithuania again. I have come today to seek your vocal and visible support for the historical fact that Tibet was never part of China. There is a draft legislation in the Senate of the United States of America that acknowledges the fact that Tibet is an unresolved international conflict. His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Central Tibetan Administration continue to seek the amicable and mutually beneficial political solution to resolve the conflict with China based on the principle of middle way landing zone for us. Dr. Walt van Praag will lay before you the facts from the important research that concluded that Tibet has never been a part of China. Lithuania, a very small country, has a massive heart of compassion when it comes to defending sovereignty and freedom. Your citizens love our leader, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and the philosophy of non-violence and his vision and message of peace and coexistence in our world, which he describes as our only home. Likewise, His Holiness has always spoken very highly of the freedom earned by the three Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. He has always treasured your love and admired your courage and determination to defend and maintain the value of liberty, democracy, truth, and justice. Lithuania has time and again given timely support for the resolution of the conflict of Sino-Tibetan conflict by providing space to us and His Holiness and expression of solidarity. His Holiness has visited your beautiful country many times in the past. Your Parliament, the Seimas, has adopted many resolutions in support of the exiled Tibetan administration and His Holiness the Dalai Lama. You were among the first countries to support us by holding a World Parliamentary Conference way back in May 1995. You were among the first countries to call upon the release of the young 11th Panchen Lama, who was abducted by the Chinese security officials at the tender age of 6 years. And you were among the first country to call for the boycott of the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympic Games. You have always shown steadfast solidarity with the people and Tibet. I thank you very much for this. At this juncture in time, Tibet is going through an existential threat to its national identity. Our language, culture, and religion under Xi Jinping's so-called unified community of Chinese nationhood, under the gospel of national unity, requires every ethnic and nationals in the People's Republic of China to be fused into one individual China. This arousing and practice of such nationalist impulse behind this campaign has far-reaching detrimental consequences to the Tibetans in our political outlook, its education, and social policies imposed by the Communist China. To achieve the so-called community of Chinese nationhood, Chinese Communist Party has adopted the policy of putting Tibetan children from the age of 6 to 18 years under Chinese state-run boarding schools. Independent reports published, this is the report in 2020, thinks that it is estimated that 78% of the Tibetan children these days are in these boarding schools where Tibetan language is not taught. They are taught only Chinese Mandarin, and these children are given very limited access to the parents and traditional social community settings to cut them off from the root of our Tibetan language and national identity. Tibetan monks and nuns have forced to practice and worship communist leaders, forcing them to be loyal to the Communist Party while denying their religious right to follow the teachings of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. This so-called re-education process has been going on since 1996. In May 2020, Chinese Communist Party has passed law to encourage mixed marriages between Han Chinese and Tibetans to achieve dilution in Tibetan race. The process of achieving this goal includes giving lucrative incentives such as bonuses, settlement allowances, business opportunities to People's Liberation Army individuals to settle permanently in Tibet. Special recognition and awards are given to the local party leaders in locations where they achieve high number of mixed marriages. This is causing the root of Tibet's dilution of race and its identity. In September this year, Human Rights Watch report new evidence of mass DNA collection in Tibet. Citizen Lab in Canada has estimated that between 920,000 to 1.2 million Tibetans of all ages, men and women, boys and girls, nuns and monks, young and old, have their DNA samples collected without consent for social control and security matters. At this point, there seems to be no end to the sufferings of the Tibetans under the Chinese Communist government. I hope that this hearing will enable Lithuanian parliaments and government to be once again one of the first among many countries to recognize this historical fact that Tibet has never been a part of China and that Sino-Tibetan conflict must need resolution through our international mechanism. Thank you so much for hearing me.
Ačiū labai. Ir dabar jau.
Thank you very much. And now I would like to give the floor to the chair of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, Ms. Laima Andrikienė. She is also a leader of the Interparliamentary Friendship Group with Tibet. The floor is yours. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I am very happy to see members of the Seimas present here, Mr. Maldeikis, Mr. Valinskas, me and Andrus. I hope other members of the Seimas will join us. I have just checked whether this event is broadcast on the Open Seimas channel, and it has been confirmed that this event is broadcast. We really wanted to have this discussion last year, however, it was hard to arrange it because of different reasons. Therefore, I am very happy that Professor de Praag and Mr. Frasi were able to come to Vilnius now. And now we have a chance to discuss the matters related to Tibet. Those of you who are in politics know very well that in Lithuania, when we speak of Tibet, for the last decade, we speak only in one aspect, that is human rights. And now we see the human rights of Tibetan people being violated. We see the different limitations of religious freedoms and persecution. We see how a unique culture is being destroyed. And this is exactly what Lithuania had experienced during the Soviet times, during the Russification process. Now we see the repercussions of the invasion of Chinese. However, we fail to speak about Tibet in terms of international law. Mr. Frase has mentioned that Tibet was occupied, and I dare say that we are avoiding this subject. And this is what is going on in the entire European Union and many other democracies. However, I am old enough to remember the 90s, when Lithuania was brave. And Lithuania had a different type of discourse. Now we are reading the annual reports of the Security Department, and now we see that not only Russia but also China are a threat to Lithuania's national security. However, when we come to addressing very specific matters, we fail to address them. We fail to see this region. I have in mind Taiwan, Tibet, and China's policy. Quite often we speak about autocracies versus democracies. The matter of Tibet is really lacking attention and political will. Yesterday, Andrus posted a message on his Facebook account, and he has done it fantastically. So I hope that you will approach this subject. The European Union is no longer seeing China as a partner, but rather as a systemic competitor. And when we speak of China posing danger to our national security, we also see, for example, the UK also referring to China as a country that is a threat. And that's how we have to look at China. These matters have to be included into our political agenda, and that's what I would like to wish to all of us. Mr. Navickas has talked about it. We need more focus on the matter, and we have to approach it from a different angle. Now when we see what's going on in China, now when we see the results of the Congress of the Communist Party, now we see that the Chinese leader has secured the unlimited power. So now it should be quite easy to see and to develop our expectations vis-à-vis that country. I think that all of us understand this. We all understand that China is a threat. Referring back to the European Union, as of 2012, Michael van Praag and his Organization of the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples, organization that was formally established in 1991. I saw it speaking in 2012 that the European Union should have its coordinator for the relations with Tibet. And it's no wonder that we still do not have it, but we have to have it. There's a huge structure of the European Union, and I think Tibet, Hong Kong, and other countries should have a right, should have a place to address their concerns. And the European Union has to have an office like this for listening the representatives of these countries and helping them to find appropriate solutions. I don't know whether you would like, Mr. Navickas, would you like to speak of what you wrote in your Facebook account yesterday? Well, now I would like to end my introductory remarks. And what you gentlemen have spoken about, it should be known to all of us that His Holiness Dalai Lama was the very first person who congratulated Lithuania on the re-establishment of its independence right after the 11th of March in 1990. He was also among the first to visit Lithuania after the January events in Lithuania. Michael was here in Lithuania. He was also during the visit of His Holiness Dalai Lama. So those of you who are as old as I am should remember this. Thank you, Michael, very much, not only for your faithfulness to Tibet and its freedom fight, but thank you for everything that you have done for Lithuania, for everything that you have been doing for Lithuania for a number of years, when we were the troublemakers, when we were the people who were causing trouble because of our need for independence. And very few countries, very few people understood us at the time and helped us. I can testify. I have seen everything myself. So I will end my introductory remarks. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Andrikene. Indeed, the matter related to Tibet is also a troublemaker. There's a book about trauma and healing, and this book says why it is easier to support the aggressor than the victim, because if you are supporting the victim, you have to do something, but if you are on the side of the aggressor, you don't have to do anything. And sometimes people say, oh, maybe it is better for Tibet to be part of China. Well, look, China is modernizing their railways. Why don't we stay away from this matter? And now Professor van Praag is going to deconstruct this statement.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Navickas and Laima Andrikiana, for your kind words and introduction. And an introduction that really is so helpful to what I hope to say. It's wonderful to be among friends, people I've known for a long time. Also Professor Žalimas, whom I met also a long time ago, but in relation to our support for the Chechens during their most difficult times. Not that they're over, but and of course to Sanam Tsering Frazi, whose introductory remarks also introduce the subject well for what I'd like to say. I think the Russian invasion of the Ukraine has once again brought home not only the horrors of war, but the need to stop and prevent and respond to aggression and occupation. The international community has fortunately reaffirmed the illegality of the use of force and the prohibition of recognizing territorial annexation obtained or attempted by the use of force. And of course, most recently in last month's United Nations General Assembly resolution on the Ukraine, which was almost unanimously adopted. And rightly so, because this prohibition against the use of force for the acquisition of territory, the prohibition of recognizing acquisition through the use of force, is perhaps the most fundamental, the most essential norm, most essential law of international law. It is the basis on which the United Nations was created. It is the basis of the UN Charter, and it is the basis of the international order that today we are a part of and that we're very much in need to protect. And so aggression must be stopped regardless of where it takes place. Today's Russian invasion of the Ukraine is in essence a repetition of China's invasion of Tibet 70 years ago. That invasion was in Europe. This invasion of the Ukraine is in Europe, and that one was in Asia. And the Western-led international community at the time did not wish to confront China, especially at a time when it was engaged in the war in Korea. And so the outcomes might become very different. And today, most governments are appeasing China when it comes to Tibet. And those misguided policies of our governments actually help China to incorporate and, in effect, to extinguish Tibet. So I'm particularly pleased to address this issue here among you, here in Lithuania, because you, more than anyone else, I think, in Europe, understand the reality of occupation and the importance of acting on the basis of truth in the face of persistent propaganda by the occupier. And given the seriousness and the urgency of the situation in Tibet, I'm going to allow myself to be very direct with you and perhaps even a little blunt at times. And I hope you'll forgive me for that. We can't ignore the truth about Tibet and fail to act just because China maintained its illegal occupation over Tibet for 70 years, for such a long time. The Soviet occupation of the Baltic states, like the Indonesian occupation of East Timor, both demonstrate that simply maintaining an occupation, maintaining hold over a territory over a period of time, even if it's a long time, does not make it legal, nor does it impede the restoration of independence, nor does it release states from their obligations in relation to those occupations. And this you understand because you've lived it, because you've struggled through it, and because you've come out of it with a restored independence. But this is not true of many other countries. In Europe, in the Western Hemisphere, or elsewhere, where they have not experienced occupation in the way that you have, and as recently as you have. In my own country, in the Netherlands, for the new generation, it is something in the distant past. and there is not a personal experience of it anymore. My parents' generation, and I was born shortly after the Second World War, still had a very clear personal type of relationship with occupation. But here in Lithuania and the other Baltic states, you do have it. And I'm also particularly pleased to be discussing it here because Lithuania has had the courage and has the courage to stand up for principles of truth, one of them relating specifically to Tibet, but also to other issues that relate to people's struggle for dignity, for human rights, and for freedom. So today, I want to first clarify the nature of the Sino-Tibetan conflict, because the truth of this has been obscured by decades of Chinese propaganda. I'll then show that governmental policies that ignore this truth and appease China are not only illegal, but also harmful. And finally, I wish to make some recommendations which I hope we can discuss with you to help bring the Sino-Tibetan conflict to an end, and therefore to end the illegal occupation of Tibet. So contrary to what the People's Republic of China has been claiming, and to what many people take for granted or don't question, Tibet was not a part of China. At no time in history did Tibet become a part of China. And this is relevant and requires our attention because the PRC bases its entitlement to Tibet, bases its argument that it has sovereignty over Tibet only, exclusively, on its assertion that Tibet has always been a part of China. The PRC has never advanced any other argument for the legitimacy of its rule of Tibet, only the historical argument that Tibet was always, or since ancient times, a part of China. And that informs whether Tibet was or was not a part of China. That informs and determines whether the PRC actually has legitimacy to rule Tibet, whether it has sovereignty over Tibet. And it determines also what the obligations and responsibilities of the international community are in relation to the Tibet-China conflict. In addition, it is essential that we understand this issue because the PRC has made it a precondition to negotiations with the Tibetan side, with the Tibetan leadership, with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, that the Dalai Lama recognize the Chinese narrative as true. In other words, that he formally states and publicly states that Tibet has always been a part of China, which His Holiness has refused to do because he believes it not to be true. And so it is really Beijing that has made history, put it at the center, at the core of the conflict. So the PRC has consistently pushed a narrative on the world that portrays Tibet as having been a part of China since antiquity. According to that narrative, the PRC simply inherited Tibet from its predecessors, from the Republic of China and earlier empires, and its armies, when they entered Tibet, were simply re-establishing an existing sovereignty to re-establish control over an area. And China has been quite successful at pushing this narrative because today many people, including officials that I meet at foreign ministries in different countries, foreign ministry officials that actually specialize in Eastern Asia, for example, are inclined to believe some part of this story, some part of the narrative, because it has been repeated so many times and in so many different ways. And as part of Beijing's strategy to convince the world that it possesses sovereignty over Tibet, it also pressures and sometimes coerces governments, also corporations, museums, universities, around the world to refer to Tibet as part of China, to make statements to that effect, to use language that conveys that. For example, Beijing always deploys carefully selected vocabulary and asks others to use it when talking about Tibet and the Tibetans, for example, relating to Tibetans as an ethnic minority or a religious group of China. Whereas, of course, the Tibetans are not only a nation, a country, and a people, but an occupied country, and insists that others use that language as well. And this is intended to foster not only international acceptance of China's claim to Tibet and rule over Tibet, but also the sense that its incorporation of Tibet is lawful and irreversible. Addressing the plight of the Tibetans and other oppressed peoples has, as you've been told, been one of my lifelong goals. And my contributions have mostly been in the international legal and diplomatic spheres. But recently I concluded a 10-year academic historical research project in order to get to the bottom of what informs the PRC governments and the Tibetan government in exile and His Holiness the Dalai Lama's opposing views on Tibet's historical status, since it is of such crucial importance. And doing so with the aim of being able to come up with strategies that people with clout, like yourselves, can use to help bring the conflict to an end. This project involved, this academic research project involved some 100 leading scholars around the world and resulted in the publication of two books, one, Sacred Mandates, International Relations since Asian International Relations since Genghis Khan, which has been recognized by the International Association of Asian Studies as the best teaching book on Asian relations, and Tibet Brief 2020, which does not refer to the year 2020, but refers to the concept of 2020 vision. In other words, clear vision about something. A title which is often missed. And so it's now being translated in German and in Japanese and some other languages. We are changing the title because that does not translate well into other languages. So if you do translate it into Lithuanian, the new title is something closer to Tibet erklärt in German, Tibet clarified or explained. So let me elaborate a little bit on the point, on the question of why it is that we have concluded after this extensive research that Tibet was in fact never a part of China. A conclusion that surprised some of us because we too have been conditioned over the years to expect that the truth lies somewhere between two positions that are often expressed. Tibet has for centuries been a political entity and, as you know, was a powerful empire at some point in that history. And Tibet, like most other polities in Asia, was not always independent in the modern legal sense of the term, because it was for significant periods of time subject to degrees of Mongol subjection, Manchu, and even British authority or influence. But what comes out of this research is that Tibet was most certainly never a part of China, as Beijing claims. And indeed, contemporaneous Chinese sources, the most authoritative ones being, for example, the official imperial histories written by Chinese officials of the emperors, and their official geographies, represent Tibet, if it is mentioned at all, as lying outside of China, and do not refer to them as being part of China. So for the PRC today to claim that it was part of China at the time is a falsification, a misrepresentation of their own history. So part of the way China represents the world and places itself in it, historically, has been, as is true of many countries, one in which they create an impression of themselves as bigger and stronger and never defeated. And that is a legitimate thing to do. I mean, we may, as historians, we may consider that wrong, but it is something that is often done to glorify a country, to glorify emperors. But if those very records themselves don't even show Tibet as part of China, then it is absurd today to start claiming that it was. Among the tricks that the PRC uses today to argue that Tibet became a part of China is the appropriation of foreign empires as Chinese and China. The great inner Asian empires of the Mongols, of Genghis Khan, is appropriated by China as the Yuan dynasty, and peoples and countries that came under the authority in one way or another of the Mongols are appropriated to the extent that China wants as part of China and as part of the Yuan dynasty, whereas they were neither. The same strategy is used in relation to the Manchu Empire of the Qing, which in both cases, it was an inner Asian empire that conquered China, that subjected the Chinese to direct rule and occupation with military cantonments in every city to keep the Chinese under the power of this foreign occupier. And yet China presents both these occupations as being Chinese rule over all the territories that these occupiers either controlled or had protectorates over, etc. In addition, Beijing today uses modern concepts of sovereignty, modern concepts of nation, of state, etc., and projects them into a past history in Asia where they simply don't belong, where they did not exist in this modern international legal context. And so that creates a misrepresentation of relations between countries, between states, between rulers that they use for to prove not only, to show not only their sovereignty over Tibet, but also over other territories. For example, parts of northern India, repeatedly, although nowadays more carefully, claims over Mongolia, claims over Taiwan, obviously, and today very actively over the South China Sea. All of them using similar type of narratives. So because Tibet was in fact not at any point a part of China and was an independent state at the time the PRC invaded Tibet in 1950-51, that invasion and the annexation that followed constituted an act of aggression and violated the peremptory norm, the obligatory norm of international law prohibiting the acquisition of territory by the use of force against another state, which we've already referred to. And this informs the legitimacy or not of the PRC's presence in Tibet. The conclusion is that China does not have sovereignty over Tibet, has no legitimacy to rule it. It is an occupying power. It illegally occupies Tibet and is preventing the Tibetan people from exercising their right to self-determination. Now, international law not only prohibits the acquisition of territory by the use of force, it actually makes it impossible. As a result, China didn't acquire sovereignty of Tibet when it seized and occupied it, and the fact that it has maintained its occupation for 70 years and its effective control over Tibet for 70 years, in the face of Tibetan opposition, does not make that legal and does not make Tibet a part of China. And what is more is that China's occupation of Tibet creates obligations for the international community. It creates obligations for other governments, for our governments. In addition, Tibetans are a colonized people under alien subjugation and domination, under the UN definition of those terms. And under international law, they therefore, again, have the full right to self-determination, which includes the right to independence. Tibetans' right to self-determination, as you know, was recognized by the UN already in 1961. But no international action was taken to enforce that resolution. And although China professes to be a very strong supporter of decolonization and self-determination, it consistently denies the Tibetans the right to exercise it. And that also violates international law, and this too comes with obligations for all of our governments. So what then are our government's obligations, concretely, in the face of China's continued occupation of Tibet? International law prohibits governments from explicitly or implicitly recognizing China's unlawful annexation of Tibet and from doing anything that helps China to consolidate its hold on Tibet and from denying the Tibetan people the right to self-determination. That, in a nutshell, is the most important set of obligations that our governments have. Secondly, it prohibits states from benefiting from the exploitation of Tibet's resources as long as Tibetans are denied the ability to make decisions concerning these resources. And third, governments have the positive obligation to take action to help bring about a resolution of the Sino-Tibetan conflict, to end the occupation of Tibet, and to enable the Tibetan people to exercise their right to self-determination. And many governments, as you know, today are acting contrary to these obligations. And they're acting contrary to these obligations in plain violation of international law, to the detriment of the resolution of the Sino-Tibetan conflict, but also, and I think this, in today's context, in relation to what's happening in the Ukraine and elsewhere, is important. It is also to the detriment of international rule of law and the protection of the international legal order. Two developments stand out in this regard. In other words, two developments stand out in regard to the violations by our governments of their obligations under international law. One, a number of governments make statements recognizing that Tibet is part of the PRC when pressured by the PRC to do so. And they treat Tibet as an internal affair outside of their purview. Now, when governments state that they consider Tibet to be a part of China or the PRC, or imply by their statements that they do, for example, by calling Tibetans a minority of China, they take away the PRC's principal incentive to negotiate with the Tibetans, and they reduce the Tibetans' main source of leverage. In the first place, because Beijing uses the statements that governments make as evidence for its claim that it has sovereignty and legitimacy over Tibet, and even for its historical claim that Tibet has always been a part of China. So now it is no longer them making the propaganda that you need to believe this. They're saying, you're saying that Tibet's part of China. That is why it is part of China. Secondly, once a government states that it considers Tibet to be a part of China, it almost cannot do anything but treat Tibet as being China's internal affair as a consequence of that statement. And this is today effectively happening. And as a result, most governments are limiting their expressions of concern to human rights abuses, to violations of minority rights. And in this way, Beijing has largely succeeded in obtaining international scrutiny and reproach only to an area where it can manage it, as you've seen recently with the visit of Chancellor Schulz to China, when human rights issues, even as severe as the genocide against the Uyghurs, is being raised, Xi Jinping just doesn't even pay attention to it. The need for the international community to take responsibility and effectively address the Sino-Tibetan conflict is not just a legal and moral imperative. It is also a political necessity. Looking the other way has been a mistake for which the international community is today paying a price as it tries to deal with an emboldened PRC, an emboldened Russia, asserting and expanding territorial claims and influence. Beijing's aggressive behavior in the South China Sea, its threatening moves towards India and Bhutan, where it presses territorial claims, its bellicose moves against Taiwan, its destruction of the internationally agreed autonomy of Hong Kong, as well as genocidal policies against the Uyghurs, are all taking place today and cannot be treated as unrelated to years of international appeasement of Beijing concerning Tibet. It is European Union policy to support a negotiated and stated policy to support a negotiated resolution of the Sino-Tibetan conflict. But the EU and its member states, or at least a number of them, their actions run counter to their own policy. Supporting a negotiated resolution of the Sino-Tibetan conflict requires the political will to be vocal about the lack of legitimacy of China's presence and rule in Tibet, not statements that imply an acceptance of China's claim to sovereignty over Tibet. It requires calling and treating Tibet what it is, an occupied country, the Tibetans what they are, a colonized people under alien subjugation and domination, not a minority or ethnic group of China, and adopting language that characterizes the Sino-Tibetan conflict for what it is, an international conflict falling squarely within the international community's purview and responsibility, and not China's internal affair. It's also EU policy not to recognize a country's attempt to annex territory by the use of force. And many world leaders, and as we just mentioned, the UN have reiterated that critical principle. So just as Russia's attempted annexation of Ukrainian territory cannot be accepted or recognized by the international community, so China's attempted annexation of Tibet must not be accepted or recognized either. Only in the absence of such recognition will the PRC government be moved to negotiate with the Tibetan leadership to resolve the conflict. And so as long as our governments imply or express that they consider Tibet to be a part of China or treat it that way, we're taking away all incentive for negotiations to resolve the conflict. Legislation has been introduced in the US Congress, as Laima Andrikiene mentioned, or as I think Sona mentioned earlier, a couple of months ago, bipartisan, bicameral, that strives to correct US behavior in this respect. It requires the United States government to abstain from explicitly or implicitly recognizing Chinese claims to Tibet, and demands that it counter Chinese propaganda in relation to China's historical narrative that Tibet has been a part of China since antiquity. The legislation also recognizes the Tibetan people's right to self-determination, and it requires of the US government proactive action to help resolve the conflict. If it's enacted into law, this act could be a game changer. But for this to happen, it needs to be accompanied by similar initiatives in Europe and elsewhere. Because such an approach sends a strong message to Beijing that the conflict it has caused by invading and occupying Tibet, as well as the future status of Tibet, can and will not be considered resolved without earnest negotiations between the PRC and Tibet and the achievement of a mutually beneficial agreement between them, one endorsed by the Tibetan people. The US Department of State also earlier stated, earlier this year, in relation to the Russo-Ukrainian war, that the US is committed to, and I quote, putting the Ukrainians in the strongest possible negotiating position. Tibet's leaders are committed to nonviolence and do not seek weapons and military support, but they do need coordinated international action at a minimum that firmly anchors Tibet's international legal status, to bolster the Tibetans' negotiating capacity, and to bring China to the negotiating table. Western and other governments have shown in recent months how coordinated diplomatic economic measures, including sanctions, can be coordinated, can be deployed to punish aggression. Such coordinated action is overdue in relation to Tibet, and in today's environment, and with Lithuanian leadership and the leadership of like-minded governments, I'm convinced it can be done. Let us see if we can discuss this and explore it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I see that we have an opportunity to ask questions. Would anyone like to ask a question? Now, I would like to use this opportunity and ask you, Professor van Praag, is it possible to achieve a breakthrough? When we look at the matter related with Taiwan, it was represented as related to economy, referring to Ukraine. We would like to say that this is a matter of security as well. However, when we speak about Tibet, everybody says, well, yes, there's a problem, but when we address all the other problems, maybe then we will come back to Tibet, because at the moment it is not possible to have the battles on many different fronts. In Lithuania, we do have a consensus on China. And a lot of people support Tibet. However, when we raise this issue, we hear the colleagues say that it's a theoretical matter. Well, you are going to speak about it, but nothing is going to change. How is it possible to achieve the breakthrough and to change something? What do you think about this? Well, while Michael is getting ready to answer the question, I would like to invite you to have a cup of coffee. We are not going to have a coffee break, however, coffee is available. Please help yourself.
This is a point that is often made, and I thank you for the question because I think it's an important one to address. I do not personally believe that under the present leadership of Xi Jinping, there is a good prospect for negotiating an acceptable solution to the Sino-Tibetan conflict. And that I say because of what you observe in the behavior of Xi Jinping and his administration in relation to all kinds of issues. There is very little willingness to negotiate, period. The obvious objective of Xi Jinping is to tighten control, not to loosen control. And so any talk of, I mean, in Hong Kong you see the autonomy is being taken away for central control. So it is unlikely that a negotiation to re-establish any form of autonomy in Tibet would be possible, in my view, under President Xi Jinping's current policies and current rule. But the one thing that I think we've all learned in our lifetimes is that everything changes, and that changes happen in the most unlikely ways, are often unpredictable, and that unless you are prepared, and by prepared I mean the Tibetans prepared and the international community prepared to take its role, when the opportunity arises, that opportunity will be lost before you get your measures in place. And so it is crucial to be to re-establish what we already knew 20, 30, 40 years ago, that Tibet was an occupied country. It's really in the last 20 years that China's propaganda has been particularly effective in diluting our knowledge about Tibet. And so what we're really trying to do is re-establish what was very clear when it happened, when Tibet was invaded, so that the international community will be able to take the right measures at the time that the opportunity arises. That's one thing. The other is that today it is important that the very urgent problems that take place, that occur in Tibet, human rights violations, the destruction of the Tibetan national identity, all of those things, that they are not only viewed but presented and addressed internationally and with China in the clearest possible way in the context of China's occupation of Tibet, as a symptom of the occupation, as a consequence of the occupation, and not simply as individual human rights violations that need to be addressed and corrected, as they are in democratic countries where human rights violations also take place at times and need to be corrected. And I think this is the fundamental change that needs to take place. And it can take place. There's no reason why governments have to make statements that they consider Tibet to be a part of China. It is not necessary, besides the fact that it's a violation of international law. There is no reason to do it. And a number of countries have now stopped doing it, and nothing has happened. They have not fallen into the sea. That's climate change. They've not been suffering extensively for it. India has stopped making that statement. A number of countries that I have visited have assured me that they in the first place, that they did it under tremendous amount of pressure and they will not do it again. I think there will be a change in that. That's a very first small step. The next step is to, as I say, to address the issue in the context and explicitly in the context of occupation. And I think that will change the mentality and momentum in how to address the Tibetan issue, and that will put China on notice that it needs to negotiate at some point, which now it does not believe it has to.
Ačiū labai ir
Thank you very much. I do not see any other members of parliament wishing to ask questions. Therefore, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Dainius Žalimas. We asked him to speak about the parallels between Tibet and Lithuania, and now probably he has been inspired by professors' ideas. Thank you, Mr. Navickas. Thank you, Madam Andrikienė, Your Excellency Frazi and Professor van Praag. It is a huge pleasure to see that you remember about our meeting some 20, 30 years ago in UNPO. Since then, from the point of view of the international law, there were basically very little changes in terms of Tibet. And Mr. Navickas has mentioned that the discussions are theoretical, that practically, basically nothing changes. But I would like to say, well, thank you for the situation. Thank you to your remarks. This is the situation that we are in right now, because if they have been listening to the theories, we wouldn't have been on the brink of the Third World War now. And if they would listen to the theories on the matters of Tibet, probably the situation would be better right now. Well, this is my brief introduction. When I listened to you, Professor van Praag, I can say that probably I have nothing new to say. I am just going to fill in the details, speaking about the parallels between Tibet and the Baltic countries. And I also have the parallel drawn between Russia and China. And Tibet, I imagine, in the place of Ukraine. When introducing the subject, I would like to express my content that we are refusing, we are moving away from this policy of not speaking about the problems. And now, I personally remember our officials speaking like this. And now I'm very happy that the situation has changed. And now I would like to draw some parallels between the Baltic states and Tibet. I have done a research on the continuity of sovereignty and identity of the state. Indeed, aggression is illegal, and there is an obligation of non-recognition. Annexation is null and void. All of this reminds me of the situation in Tibet. Quite often I see a different type of behavior vis-à-vis Tibet than it was vis-à-vis the Baltic states. back then. It may not be convenient to recognize that the international community is also sometimes violating the international right. Tibet was legally occupied and it's fighting for its independence. I had a thesis. I was working on a thesis, and I was doing it under the head of Vilain Vodopal. And he has said on Tibet, I do not know whether he has said it publicly or not, but I do remember Mr. Vodopal mentioning Tibet as a model of state cannibalism when a state was consumed and nobody seemingly protested over it. Well, taking into consideration what Professor van Praag has said and referring to the international law, I can say that the PRC states that it has rights to Tibet on the basis of certain historical circumstances or a historical argument that Tibet has always been a constituent part of China. Professor has said, and we know the facts, that prove the distortion of this theory. And the parallels are very clear. I remember the year 2017 when we condemning Russia for its annexation of Crimea. And back then, it has been said by one of the representatives of the court, well, there were many changes near the borders of Russia. Certain states were included, certain states were excluded. Therefore, Russia has its historical rights to annex certain states to its territory. And I would like to say that these words have been pronounced by a lawyer, not a politician. And now the same historical argument is being used that these are the historical Russian lands, and we Lithuanians would be silly to think that we are not part of this argument. Putin has clearly stated that historical Russia is the entire former Soviet Union. Therefore, we should have no doubts, despite the fact that it is absolutely not true, that we now are living in the historic land of Russia. And this narrative, the very similar narrative, is being developed vis-à-vis Tibet. And the first ruler of Tibet was known even before Christ. I think there was an agreement between Tibet and China on the border that they are not going to have a war against each other. And quite recently, my acquaintance from Ukraine sent me a book written in Russia on the history of Ukraine. And this book begins with a statement that Russians and Ukrainians are one nation. Ukraine has always been part of Russia. And this was the point where the history of Ukraine started. That was the point of departure. And I think the same style is used in Sino-Tibetan relations. I see the same rhetoric used. When we use the term historical rights, historical arguments, even though Tibet had been part of China, though it wasn't true, we have learned from you, Professor van Praag. Legally, from the legal point of view, that would have no importance. For example, if Lithuania would remember the fact that once it had its territory stretching in Latvia, and then it would try to use this as the basis to demand this territory. Well, legally, this is null and void. And now I would like to remind you of two cases. One was a case in 1958. If I remember correctly, this was the case between France and UK, and the case on Western Sahara in 1975. That's where historical arguments were employed. And it turned out all the historical arguments were ruled out in that case. And the sovereignty and the real power were the arguments that were considered important. Choyon had specific relations that remind me of vassal relations with Tibet. However, nobody has taken away real power from Tibetan leaders. And now we can remember the fact that the International Court of Justice said that there was a historical agreement. Or, for example, if we relate to Morocco's, so to speak, rights to certain islands, that somebody had an ownership in the Western Sahara, this was not considered as a relationship of public power, or the territory of, or a sovereign territory. Therefore, all of these discourses are in favor of Tibet, not China. Even if we say that once, many years ago, there was a certain subordination, now it has no legal power. And besides that, these relations were not like that. Referring to the situation between 1911 and 1949, I would like to say that there was no significant relationship between Tibet and China. I would like to refer to Montevideo Conference of 1933, which says that the appearing of the state is a fact. A state may not be politically recognized. And even a state that has not been recognized has all its rights, including the right of defense from aggression. That may be in a way similar to the situation that Tibet finds itself in. Beyond doubt, Tibet had the classical features of a state, which was a territory, a nation, its identity of a separate state and clearly defined territory where this nation lived and is living. There was a clear structure of power. There were spiritual and political leaders. Tibet had its parliament and the cabinet of ministers. It had its sovereignty and independence. The proof is its neutrality during the Second World War, and other countries respected it. For example, Tibet refused to allow to use its territory for the transit, military transit between India and China. And the British soldiers that deserted from the army were not sent back from Tibet. And now Tibet, the continuity of the statehood of Tibet is not recognized. However, the relations with Nepal, Bhutan, and India were recognized. I think China also had its representative in Tibet. So this is a proof that Tibet had all its features of a state. The events of the 1949 have to be qualified as an act of aggression. As in 1928, Bryan-Kellogg Pact, or a general agreement on refusing to be at war, and there was the UN Charter that banned the use of force. In 1951, we can remember certain parallels with the Baltic states and Ukraine. I think it has been in 1951 there was an agreement that was called an Agreement of Peaceful Liberation of Tibet, and the Chinese were freeing Tibetans from Tibet. Tibet from Tibetans. So the rhetoric they called it peaceful liberation from the nationalists. And the rhetoric that Tibet is returning to the great embrace of Mother China. Russia used exactly the same rhetoric. And this agreement on the peaceful liberation of Tibet is considered null and void, because the Vienna Convention states that violence against the representatives of the government was used. And their right was restricted. Therefore, they signed this agreement without having a freedom. They were threatened. And basically, this agreement was the consequence of force. And now I would like to recall the International Tribunal in Nuremberg in 1946, which regarded the annexation of Austria in the same terms. Nazis stated that Austria kind of wanted to be annexed. It was a partial truth. However, the International Tribunal Court of Nuremberg I remember somebody saying that Putin cannot be compared to Hitler. However, referring back to the Court of Nuremberg, it has been ruled that the agreement of the state was null and void. Because the military power of Germany or the military power of China could be used if the agreement wasn't given. Indeed, the international law cannot have double standards. The Court of Nuremberg against the Nazi criminals had its rulings. Russia is trying to use the arguments that are in favor to it. However, the rulings of Nuremberg court were considered universal. And the same criteria had to be applied to all parties. Tibet's agreement, the so-called agreement to the annexation, therefore has no legal power. I can say that this could be an exception. However, Tibet could be regarded as a sole exception when annexation was recognized by the international community. However, as of 1932, the international law has Timson's doctrine, as for Sino-Japanese relations, no agreement can be made in violation of non-aggression fact. Tibet is an exception. Tibetan case is an exception to that rule. I do agree with Professor van Praag that ex seniora legal principle is in effect. That means that China never had rights to the territory of Tibet. In terms of international law, Tibetan territory should be regarded as an occupied territory by China, and all Geneva Conventions have to be applied to this case. However, the Geneva Conventions do not stop aggressors, as we can see in Russia-Ukraine relations. However, it means the continuity of the state. And according to the conventions, Tibet has to be considered as the state that should be able to implement its international rights. However, now its opportunities to do that are limited. Lawyers will probably not be able to give any recipes for success. Lawyers can only draw red lines. However, they have already been stepped over. The continuity of the statehood of the Baltic states could be a model when restoring the independence of Tibet. Therefore, the Baltic countries could be the most important model for Tibet. Referring back to the occupation to Austria, which has been occupied from 1938 to 1955, however, the restoration of its independence was recognized. And it demonstrates that the international community should not accept this illegal annexation as the final fact that cannot be changed. The continuity of statehood is based on two pillars. The first pillar is the will of the people to have its state. And now we see the entire public structure of Tibet in exile. And the second pillar, and the continuity of the statehood of the Baltic countries, was also based on the second pillar. And this is the international recognition of the continuity of the statehood. Now it is not really in favor of Tibet, however, it can use it theoretically. It is possible. We should also bear in mind what Professor van Praag has touched upon is the following. Based on the justice, that principle would be sufficient. However, we have other principles that do not allow treating the Sino-Tibetan relation as Tibet being part of China, and this is the self-determination of the nations. The country faced aggression. The free determination of nations is the source of statehood. And now there is no other free determination of Tibetan people than to have their own state. And this is yet another argument why we have to provide the conditions for free self-determination of Tibetans. Because based on the international law, all nations, including the Tibetan nation, have a right of self-determination, and they have a right to choose their political status by establishing their own state or choosing other forms of their political status. Tibetans have to have all conditions for self-determination, and because this right has been turned down as of 1949. Normally, it has been said that when we speak about Tibet, we refer mostly to human rights situation. However, Tibet is not the internal matter of China, because we have the respect for human rights, and gross violations of human rights can be clearly qualified as genocide. We have heard about the genocide of Uyghur people, when indeed we can speak about the genocide of Tibetans because their language is being diluted, their families, their race is being diluted. And we have also faced this policy in Lithuania by Russians. However, it is being implemented in a more brutal way by China. Because the sanctions may be imposed, the punishment, people may face the punishment even for having the photograph of His Holiness Dalai Lama. And the people may be imprisoned for many years just for that. And there is an attempt to make this community extinct. Therefore, gross and systemic human rights violations can be regarded as genocide. And they can never be an internal matter of a state. That's where I would like to conclude. Allow me to remind the 3 red lines. Unfortunately, some of them have been stepped over. So first and foremost, it is non-recognition of annexation, and this is an obligation based on international law. Secondly, self-determination of nations. All conditions have to be provided for the Tibetan people to determine on their statehood. And thirdly, gross and systemic violations of human rights that can be equal to genocide. It can never be an internal matter of the state, and the entire international community has to react towards this. And if the global community could act on at least one of these principles, the situation in Tibet could have been better. Well, to end on a happier note, if somebody has told us in the 1970s or the 1980s that Lithuania would be free, we could have regarded as science fiction. Therefore, I would like to wish you the continuation of your effort. Please continue this fight for your freedom. And sometimes, in perspective, the period of time of 50 years seems very short when countries regain their independence. Thank you very much for your attention.
Ačiū labai Dainiui.
Thank you, Dainius. Now, before beginning the discussion, I have a question to Dainius Žalimas. We are speaking about the difference between the Baltic states situation and Tibet. The world had the non-recognition policy towards the Baltic states. And I don't understand quite well what are the arguments of today. Professor van Praag and Professor Žalimas gave the arguments why Tibet should be considered as occupied according to the international law. Why is this being ignored? Why countries still ignore this fact and fail to recognize Tibet as an occupied country, and that this one China policy is being pursued by countries around the world? Well, this is a complicated issue, and I do not know whether it is from the international law. We do not have those counter-arguments. These are propaganda terminology that we hear, that Tibet is the same nation as China, that Tibet has always belonged to China, that Tibet contains extremists and nationalists. But sometimes when counter-arguments cannot be found, different labels are being attached. And this happens in different discussions. Well, I never heard any serious legal arguments for that, and this is a paradox. Many lawyers speak about the prohibition of aggression, the continuity of sovereignty, but very seldom do they remember Tibet. The truth, unfortunately, is not always fashionable, and actually this is an issue of determination, and time comes for us to learn and understand that you cannot ignore the truth, and you cannot ignore the fact. Actually, the situation in Ukraine is the consequence of ignoring the reality. And speaking about Tibet, it is very uncomfortable for some people to speak about the violation of international law, and therefore the choice of silence is being made. And sometimes propaganda cliches are being repeated. And my question goes to Professor Mikael van Walt van Praag. We see Russian aggression against Ukraine, and it actually brought on the agenda the issue of Tibet. And all the arguments used by China against Tibet are now used by Russia against Ukraine. And we always have hopes that when Russia loses the war, a new rules-based order will be established with the rules created. But we sometimes have fears that the importance of China in international policy is high, and if sometimes we hear people say that when we have problems with Russia, we should leave China alone because we have too many problems with Russia. China should not be pro-Russian. You visit other countries and you listen to different trends and different discourses there. What do you hear there? What conclusions can you make from the discourse abroad in terms of appeasing China in comparison to Russia? This is a question to Professor van Praag and also Sonam Tsering Frasi.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think for a long time, also during the Cold War, China and Russia were seen as, by many countries, as countries that there was a fear that they would somehow work together, cooperate, and unite, and so policies were developed to try to not have that happen, and therefore not upset China. I think that was certainly part of Nixon and Kissinger's policy at the time. I think today there is a similar type of fear that Russia and China can cooperate, and indeed, to a certain extent, it is happening. And also, as you mentioned, a tendency by some to say, let us not oppose two large forces like this at the same time. Let's deal with one at a time. The mistake, I think, is that both of them represent the same type of threat. Both of them represent the same type of authoritarian, anti-democratic, rules-based international order approach. And so you can't really oppose one when it is aggressing or when it is violating basic rules of the international order and not do the same with the other. I think a principled approach is necessary. I know it is difficult. I think that Lithuania is giving an example which is remarkable and very praiseworthy, as I mentioned earlier, especially because this is not one of the major powers of the world, and yet you're showing by example that it can be done. My hope is that you can, by your membership in the European Union, play a role in trying to develop a more coordinated policy within the European Union among its members towards China, in particular on Tibet, but on other issues that we've mentioned today as well. And this, I think, is not at all unrealistic. I think the EU is in a place where it needs to reassess its China policy and its policy towards Tibet. But if nobody pushes for specific attention to Tibet, it's not going to happen. For the reason that you said earlier also about that it's easier to support the aggressor than the victim. If we do not effectively press for it, by default, the issue does not get put high on the agenda. And I think that is part of the answer to your earlier question to Professor Žalimas, of why, in the case of Tibet, the non-recognition policy was not implemented in the way that it is in relation to the Ukraine and was in relation to the Baltic states to a large extent, is because it has not been effectively pressured. Countries have not been effectively pushed to apply the non-recognition policy. At the time, Tibet, when it was invaded, Tibet did not have the kinds of international relations that the Baltic states had in Europe, for example. Tibet had it locally, but not with Western countries, for example, and not with most countries in the world. And it was not a member of the League of Nations. It was not a member of the United Nations. And so that made it very difficult at the time for the Tibetans to effectively push their case. And I think that was one of the tragedies of that situation that we're still experiencing the consequences of today.
Tai trumpai noriu pasidalinti, kad
I want to briefly say that I've been naive and surprised when one top official from Lithuania who came back from Germany, he said that you can agree with politicians, but there are some corporations, big corporations, manufacturing corporations that say no. We speak about politicians, theoretical politicians, practical politicians. China is having this economic expansion, and I hope that in the future it will decrease. Are you willing to react, or should we continue our discussion? Do you have any reactions? Well, yes. I didn't want to say that, but the situation why Tibet's annexation is actually recognized. This is, well, it is specific in history due to Tibetan policies as well, because Tibet was not a member of the League of the Nations. But this is a lesson for our region, that neutrality is not always favorable. Well, certainly this does not apply to Lithuania now, but when we speak about Ukraine's future, we see that neutrality cannot always be favorable. Tibet wanted to preserve its specificity, its unique character against globalization, wanted to uphold and maintain the neutrality, and this neutrality was respected by countries such as the United Kingdom, but it is too naive to expect that some aggressive countries can respect other countries' neutralities. So this was the illusion. In terms of business and business expansion by China, I believe in 2018 Lithuania hoped doing much business with China, and we are reaping the fruits because of this policy. And I think that businessmen should do business and should not dictate policies. The situation that we are having now is the consequence of the fact that policy often was the hostage of business. Anyone from the audience? I can see people raising their hands. Could you introduce yourself? Good morning. Robertas Mažeika, Tibet Support Group. I want to speak on the isolation of Tibet. It is very important to support the government of Tibet in exile. The examples of US leadership, when there is an official representative for Tibet, and a special act was adopted in terms of support to Tibet. And as far as I read, the sovereignty of the Tibetan government is recognized in exile, and its representation to the Tibetan nation. In the EU, we try to follow the soft power by awarding His Holiness the Dalai Lama the Nobel Peace Prize, but we do not know what might happen in the future. we don't know the ratio between the Tibetans and the Chinese in Tibet. And it is very important to support the Tibetan government in exile. The European Parliament has decided in the past of having a representative for Tibet, but unfortunately this has not been done. Interinstitutional cooperation with the Tibetan government in exile is very important. It is important to recognize this government. Maybe Mr. Frasi would like to react to this. I can only remind you that in several weeks' time we will have 3 members of Parliament of Tibet in exile, and we will organize their meetings with top officials in order to understand that they are being accepted, that they are being recognized, and that they are being heard and understood. So, I'm addressing Sonam. What else can we do to help you? What else can we do to contribute?
So thank you for this question. I would like to say something like this. The rise of China through economy and the expectation of the West in the pursuit of better relationship with China, if the economy, if the standard of living in China increases, will lead to liberation and democracy in China. This theory has failed. So the China has now come to a more of an inward country through Xi Jinping, and the Americans, with the sanctions and the break on the Chinese rise in economy, will have a detrimental effect on China, which will lead to many, I think, problems in China, which could give opportunity for the West to be more assertive. And this is already happening in most of the Western countries. People's outlook to China has changed hugely for the last, say, 6-7 years. People are very concerned about the threat of China and the security aspect of China and the intrusion of China into Western lifestyle. The famous quote of, if you don't change China, China will change you, is coming to the West. So I think there will be America has started the economic embargo on the rise of China. We are seeing in United Kingdom and other countries in this effect. So what we are really now seeking for is, if it is at all possible, to have a special coordinator in the EU countries to represent Tibet, Hong Kong, Uyghur as a broad coalition, so that we can approach not only all the different countries, but most of the countries can be within the EU. We can have a single standpoint which could help Tibet. I think this is something we are pursuing, which we need to, we feel is very, very important. Other things, Michael has already dealt with this. Individual countries, Lithuania is one of the bravest country to give resolutions in support of Tibet not being part of China. America has, as Michael has already said, and if we can do this kind of active policy towards denying and confronting China's story on Tibet will be very helpful. In the United Kingdom, what we are pursuing to do is UK has, since 2008, they recognize Tibet as part of China. And this is now, we have a small window of opportunity because the environment is changing. The people's outlook on China is changing. So we are we've already met with the people in the foreign ministry in United Kingdom, and we are requesting them to withdraw their 2008 statement which recognized Tibet as part of China. So something like this, where countries have done this, we are asking them to withdraw. Where countries which hasn't made, we would like to ask them to specifically put resolutions, if it's possible, to say that Tibet was invaded and not part of China. So this will help, because I think what we must do, America is leading, and America needs Europe. We cannot say confrontation of China is an American job. Europe needs to be with America so that China sees the whole Western countries as single entity. Of course, Schulz's visit to China so soon after his power to the third term is a very, very big, bad signal that was given. But I think Europe needs to help America by supporting each country accepting this kind of situation. That would be a wonderful thing, and it will progress. Why it is important? Tibetans in Tibet, as I said in my remark, after 72 years, they are looking for independence. They are looking for outside help. They can't do anything. Everything is controlled. Their life is controlled by China completely. Tibetans are not issued any passport since 2015 to travel outside of China. You see thousands of Chinese students coming out to universities in the West, America, everywhere, but you find hardly 1 or 2 Tibetans. And these Tibetans are denied all the passports. They can't travel anywhere. They do not want the story of Tibet to be told anywhere outside. So it is like a small prison for the Tibetans. And they are hoping and praying for His Holiness to return, and that world will help His Holiness to liberate Tibet. I think this is the gist of Tibetans in Tibet are hoping. And if countries like Lithuania and others can help, that would be an enormous benefit. Thank you.
Now, your question, and I will ask both professors to make the final remarks, because we are having lunch and we should follow our schedule. It's Edvardas Trončikas, the representative of the Lithuanian Prisoners Union and persons victims of occupations. My question is about the Chinese veto right in the United Nations. I think that we should speak about the reconstruction of the United Nations in order to push the question of Tibet if, for example, China does not have the veto right. Is it possible? Is this reconstruction or change is possible? Thank you for your question. I will not give any hopes to you on that. Well, this is a paradox that both dictatorships that are represented in the Security Council of the United Nations are represented by different names than inscribed in the United Nations Charter. You cannot find either the Chinese People's Republic or the Russian Federation in the Charter of the United Nations, but this is another legal issue. I do not think that is a reality and a possibility that the decision of the United Nations of 1970 to replace the Taiwanese representatives by the Chinese People's Republic representatives, in theory, when we speak about this situation and a threat to international peace and stability, and the international threat, the country should abstain from voting on the resolution. And I think we should not hope that the Chinese representatives could abstain from discussing and voting on the matter that they are directly involved. Speaking about the reform of the United Nations, I can say that it is impossible, because any reform would require the amendments to the Charter of the United Nations, and the Charter can be amended by 2/3 of votes of all the member states. But importantly, all the 5 members of the Security Council should be present in those voting for. It is impossible to withdraw China from the United Nations. For that, we need the recommendation of the Security Council, and China will not recommend withdrawing from the United Nations. The mechanism was specifically established for giving exclusive rights to some countries. I think that only the change of the regime can actually lead to certain resolution of an issue. Thank you very much. Now I would like to ask Professor van Praag and Professor Dainius Žalimas to make some concluding remarks.
Good afternoon, Vytautas Danevičius. I represent Tibetan support group. I would like to ask a question to Mr. Žalimas, and the question is the following: would the legal situation be different if single China policy is no longer used, and if Taiwan is being recognized as an independent republic? Thank you for the question. Well, let's not talk about things that are not real. And I cannot imagine that the Chinese government residing in Taiwan could be recognized. Besides that, I think it would be fairer to ask this question to the representatives of Taiwan. Democracy is better because it is not based on force. on power. And especially when referring to the sensitive matters, such as this one. Any democratic government would be easier to agree upon different things, whether it is the continental Chinese government or any other government. So, please ask questions if you have any. Then I will give the floor to our guests, and I would like to remind you of the fact that you can find the recording of this event in both languages, and you're welcome to share the recording with anyone you know in order to spread the message. Well, thank you very much. It is hard to summarize the conversation, this roundtable discussion. The case of Tibet it's a kind of international argument, an international conflict, including different violations of the law. And it can be used for checking how effective the international law is. Sometimes one thinks that the situation is hopeless, but then unexpectedly law and fairness wins. Therefore, I would like to remind all of you to remain faithful to the superiority of the law. Legally, everything is clear. It is hard to find a situation that is so clear from the legal point of view. However, if we do not lose this determination to follow the principles of the rule of law, we can make this happen. And whenever we try to go the easier path, we create the situation that may be dangerous for all of us. We did have the red lines, and we know where they have been violated. And the practical work of restoring law and justice is a matter of practitioners. Therefore, I would like to wish success to all of us. Thank you, Professor Dainius Žalimas, for your participation and for your consistency in supporting the Tibetan case, as you have put it. And I wish you to remain in this position of an inconvenient personality.
Yes, just to perhaps leave you with some concrete suggestions. Besides the one that I've already mentioned, and I'm not going to repeat everything, but just simply for this country, for this government, to implement a firm non-recognition policy, the way you're supposed to according to international law, and to try to convince other countries with whom you have friendly relations to do the same. I think there are some countries now that are like Lithuania, courageous and standing up to China. The Czech Republic is a good example, as long as they maintain their present government, which I hope they will. And there are other countries, I think, that, and of course the United States, and it's a powerful player, and so my hope would be that you would find ways to connect and cooperate with those countries that already are willing to take this kind of position to start with, and then to broaden the coalition to other countries. There are some that may be willing to reconsider their policies if they see that 2 or 3 countries are already doing it. Nobody wants to be the first, nobody wants to be alone. But if others are like-minded, are taking steps, it is much more likely that, for example, Sweden and Ireland and some other countries, even the Netherlands, would be willing to take these steps. The Netherlands has had for a long time a policy of not stating anything on the matter. And so it is, if you will, a de facto non-recognition policy. But this, I think, broadening the number of countries that are willing to adopt a non-recognition policy is an important goal. Pleading for or working towards a special coordinator on Tibet or on issues related, as Sonam Frazi mentioned earlier, at the EU level, to help coordinate EU policies on these matters is important, because it's extremely difficult to get all the EU countries on one line. And when we speak to any individual EU country, they say, oh, we just follow EU policy. And when you speak to the EU, they say, oh, policy is made in the States. And so there has to be some mechanism to ensure that China is not effectively continuing to be able to divide and rule Europeans when it comes to issues like Tibet and others that are related. And for Tibet support groups, I think also, and governments as well, but Tibet support groups should perhaps also consider this obligation of not just states but also corporations not to benefit from the exploitation of resources of an occupied country. This is also illegal. And there may actually be ways that one could bring some of these things to court as well, when there's an obvious link with resources in Tibet. The same way as the Uyghurs are being extremely effective in bringing lawsuits in different countries because cotton is being used that is the result of forced labor in East Turkestan. Similar thinking could be developed perhaps to bring some pressure and awareness in the world about the illegality of China's occupation of Tibet. Thank you.
Ačiū labai ir
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, our time is almost up. Good afternoon. I would like to mention culture, religion, and traditions. And this is a very important area besides the land and other things. Art, painting, dance can also be used for this purpose. I just wanted to remind you of this area in life. Well, thank you. But the thing is, if we fail to defend the freedom of Tibet, these things are being destroyed. Well, thank you very much for reminding us of this. Now I would like to thank all the participants, including interpreters. The interpreters are grateful to you as well.